Good afternoon. Welcome to the South Carolina version of our state webinar series exploring the findings from American Farmland Trust's recently released Farms Under Threat, the State of the States report. Before we get started, let me run through some quick logistics. Everyone has been muted, so no need to do that yourself. If you would like to ask a question or to make a comment, you can do so by going to the control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. The orange arrow at the top of that panel allows the panel to shrink and reopen. You'll see a question section of the control panel. You can pop that section out by clicking on the little square on the right-hand side. That decouples it from the control panel, allowing you to type in a question or a comment. And we will have a couple of opportunities for questions during the presentation. We are also recording the webinar and will send the recording link to everyone who is registered. Please feel free to share this recording with others. So let me now introduce myself. I am Chris Coffin, American Farmland Trust's Senior Policy Advisor. I also direct our newly launched National Agricultural Land Network, which I'll talk about at the end of the webinar. Co-hosting with me is Billy Van Pelt. Billy is AFT's Senior Director of External Relations and is based in Kentucky. Billy is focused on the expansion of AFT's national initiatives across the Southeast. And for those of you not familiar with American Farmland Trust, let me do a very quick introduction. We are a national nonprofit membership organization founded in 1980. Some know us best by our No Farms, No Food bumper sticker. We work from kitchen tables to the halls of Congress. We are an agricultural land trust, but also focus on promoting sound farming practices through soil health and water quality initiatives. We also recognize that it's not farmland without farmers, so focus on tools and strategies that facilitate land access for next generation producers and assist with farm transfer and succession strategies for retiring farmers and farmland owners. Our programming and research informs our state and federal policy development and advocacy. We have 6 regional offices and a national office located in Washington, D.C. So let me now turn it over to Billy.
Thanks, Chris. We are delighted to be joined today by a number of valued partners, including Furman University, Clemson University, Palmetto Green, Upstate Forever, Lowcountry Land Trust, the Nature Conservancy, Congaree Land Trust, Ducks Unlimited, Grow Food Carolina, Coastal Conservation League, numerous other stakeholders from across the state, and USDA's Natural Resources Conservation Service. Thank you all for joining us today. We'd like to recognize and thank NRCS especially for their collaboration and support of this project. They've been an integral partner, as has our research partner on this project, Conservation Science Partners.
Thanks, Billy. So now we're going to talk about the findings from our Farms Under Threat report. Today we're focusing on the State of the States, which is the second in this research series. State of the States paints a striking picture of the threats facing working farms and ranches in every state and documents the steps every state has taken to protect their agricultural land base from development. We used a multi-pronged approach that included advanced spatial mapping to identify the threats to agricultural land and an in-depth analysis of state policy responses. We're using this report to raise public awareness, to inform state and federal policy, and to encourage more direct and permanent agricultural land protection. For those of you who did not join us for our launch events in May, let me touch very quickly on our national findings. We studied a period from 2001 to 2016. This is a period of historically low housing starts with a deep recession in the middle. Despite this, the U.S. converted 11 million acres of agricultural land. That's equivalent to all of the land planted in the entire U.S. to fruits, nuts, and vegetables in 2017. The majority of that conversion was to low density residential land use. We've known this type of conversion was happening because all across the country, scattered large lot housing has been fragmenting and disrupting farming and ranching for years. But until this report, no one has ever been able to map it and measure it. And once we mapped it, we realized just how big of a threat it is. Importantly, more than 1/3 of the land converted, about 4.4 million acres, was what we have identified as nationally significant land, the land best suited for intensive food and crop production. As you can see from this next map, South Carolina has the unfortunate distinction of being in the list of 12 most threatened states. These 12 represent the states with the highest number of acres converted or the highest percent of acres converted. You can see that South Carolina is not alone amongst the other southern states. So now we're going to dive into the data available for South Carolina on our new interactive website, which we hope you all will make use of. And we're going to be ably assisted in our cruise through the website by our colleague, Beth Fraser. So thank you, Beth. Let's start by pointing out the tab on the right, the Reports and Data tab. This is where you'll find fact sheets that describe the methodology. You'll find the full report. And if you are interested in getting access to the geospatial data we used, this geospatial data layers tab that Beth is pointing out right here, if you click on it, it will take you to a form to fill out, and we will be back in touch to let you know what is available and when it will be available. So now let's go to the drop-down menu and choose South Carolina. And from here, you can see that you can access both the spatial data and the policy scorecard information. And before we get started, we're actually going to show you the downloadable conversion summary down there on the lower left. If you click on that, it takes you to a 2-page PDF. There's also a comparable one for the policy scorecard. We created those because we know that people love to have things that are easily downloadable, particularly for those of us who are challenged with the amount of bandwidth we have working remotely. This can be used to talk to policymakers, to talk to journalists, to put in a newsletter to members. There are a number of different uses for it, and we hope people will download it and make use of it as they can. So now we're going to go to the spatial data layers. We're going to start with land cover and use. So we used multiple national data sets to develop the best available spatial inventory of agricultural land use in the US. You can zoom in on this data layer to identify every type of land use in the state, including land that we've identified as low density residential development. That is the orange parts of the map, and the dark red are the urban areas. It also includes a first ever attempt to spatially identify woodland associated with a farm or ranch. Our mapping shows 5.79 million acres of agricultural land in the state, including 2.6 million acres of cropland, 2.1 million acres of woodland associated with farms, and 1 million acres of pasture land. So now we're going to move to PVR values. Here, we wanted to analyze the quality of land that is being lost to development, not just the quantity. So we created, with the help of a national panel of experts, an index to quantify the productivity, versatility, and resiliency, or PVR, of every acre of land in the US. This map shows the range of those PVR values across the state. The darker the green, the higher the PVR value, and the higher the PVR value, the higher the suitability of this land for long-term intensive crop production, especially for food crops such as fruits, nuts, vegetables, and staple grains. We then took these PVR values to identify what we call nationally significant land. And this next map shows the nationally significant agricultural land in South Carolina. You'll see that 2.8 million acres falls into this category, about 49% of the state's entire agricultural land base. And of that 2.8, about 2 million acres of this is cropland, with a little under 500,000 acres in woodland and 360,000 acres in pastureland. The last category here is conversion. This data looks at a 15-year period, again from 2001 to 2016, and we looked at conversion to two distinct types of land use. The first is urban and highly developed land use, or UHD. This includes the traditional culprits in farmland conversion, so expanding residential, commercial, and industrial areas, typically found in cities and towns. The category also includes rural industrial and energy production sites, including oil and well pads and solar installations. The second type of conversion is low density residential development, or LDR. This is the first effort of its kind to quantify the extent of large lot housing on the agricultural land base. And these LDR areas range from lower density subdivisions to rural areas where more and more individual houses are being built. More than 2/3 of conversion in South Carolina over this 15-year period, 70%, or 197,000 acres, was to LDR. This doesn't necessarily mean that there's no active agricultural land or active agriculture on land designated as LDR. There may well be, and it may be that some of that small parcel production is very productive and profitable. But we also know that LDR tends to be a transitional land use. Land in South Carolina that was considered LDR in 2001 was 8 times more likely to be converted to urban and highly developed land by 2016 than other agricultural land. And we know that continued conversion to LDR increases management challenges for producers who end up farming in and around non-farm neighbors. Total agricultural land converted over this 15-year period was almost 281,000 acres. Cropland conversion accounted for 105,000 acres, followed by woodland with 101,000, followed by pasture with 75,000 acres. And in looking at the quality of the land converted, about 40% of the land was considered nationally significant. The loss of this especially productive land is concerning from several perspectives. As producers are forced to more marginal land, their input costs tend to go up and crop yields tend to go down. The loss also creates more pressure to convert woodlots and buffer strips to cropland. So reducing conversion to development is critical in making progress on water quality and wildlife habitat goals. So with that, I'm going to stop and turn it over to Billy for some additional perspectives about the spatial findings.
Thanks, Chris. As we take a look at our spatial findings today, I think it's important to note that what we're looking at here is the red is what has been converted over a 15-year period. I want to make sure we're all clear on that. And the dark gray that you're seeing are urbanized areas. And so I would just like to point out the proliferation of sprawl to urban high density and to low density land uses in the Greenville and Spartanburg areas. And you can see the fragmentation of agriculture, particularly as it relates to PBR land, productive, versatile, and our resilient soil. So you can see that it becomes very challenging when you have the sprawl there in red integrated with your best farmland. And what we're seeing across the country, this is a trend where sprawling cities start merging together. And so if we could zoom out a bit and take another look at the state, as we move closer to the coast, to the Charleston area, you'll see that the the development patterns along the Myrtle Beach areas also have a significant sprawl. And then as we look here, and I think it's important to note, the Columbia area is also an area with significant sprawl, a significant conversion. And so American Farmland Trust hosted a webinar 2 years ago in Charleston with several stakeholders in the room. And one thing became very clear, and this is not unique to South Carolina, it's something that's unique to all of our coastal states. As we have sea level rise in the future and our citizens begin moving inland, the productive, versatile, and resilient soils, the nationally significant soils, are going to be under greater threat. So this creates a sense of urgency to conserve these best lands now. And I'll be making additional comments about planning for the future of agriculture later during the webinar. Back to you, Chris.
Great, thank you, Billy. Before we turn to the policy scorecard, we actually want to stop and get some input from all of you on the webinar. We're interested in your perspectives on what you think will drive agricultural land conversion in South Carolina over the next 10 to 20 years. And the reason why we ask that now is that it helps us all to think about what are the appropriate and needed policy responses based on what we think will be the drivers of conversion in the future. So you're welcome to select more than one answer. And if you're having any trouble voting, it might be because you are in full screen mode, which you may have to get out of in order to be able to vote. So we'll take a minute to let people vote, and then we'll come back. Okay, Beth, what are we seeing here? This is very consistent with what we have seen when we posed the same question in webinars in other states, that folks continue to feel that more, and particularly more poorly planned development, especially residential, commercial, industrial, is going to drive a lot of farmland loss. But with a growing number of people who are concerned about the generational transfer of land and what happens to it as it transfers, which is something that AFT is very focused on at the moment. So this is very helpful in thinking about this as we go into the policy scorecard. So with that, turning to the scorecard, our intent here is to highlight effective elements of state policies that address these traditional drivers of ag land conversion. So poorly planned development, weak agricultural viability. We know that one of the best ways to keep farmland in farming is to have profitable farm businesses, and the vulnerability of land when it transfers between generations. While AFT has been deeply involved in federal and state agriculture and conservation policy since our founding, this is our first effort at a state policy scorecard. And we know that there are many ways that states support agriculture, and we did not attempt to score them all. South Carolina, like many other states, has marketing and other ways of other programs that support agriculture and the business of agriculture in a number of different ways. Our focus was on 6 different types of policies and programs that tie directly to the land and address one or more of these conversion drivers. So the policies and programs we looked at, which you can see on the left, are purchase of agricultural conservation easement or purchase of development right programs, voluntary programs that permanently protect farmland and ranchland from non-farm development, and compensate landowners who choose to place a permanent agricultural conservation easement on their property. So the South Carolina Conservation Bank is one of 28 state PACE programs. We looked at land use planning and growth management. Most states, including South Carolina, delegate planning authority to local governments, and planning and zoning decisions we know are driven largely at the county and municipal level. As Billy is going to discuss later, local governments need a suite of effective tools to support compact development and retain agricultural land. States, though, can play an active and important role in guiding local planning and supporting local governments with the right tools and incentives to stabilize the agricultural land base. And that's what we looked at here. We looked at property tax relief for agricultural land, which South Carolina, along with every other state in the country, has in some way of reducing property taxes paid on agricultural land in recognition that working lands require far less municipal services than the taxes typically levied on them. We looked at agricultural district programs. There are 18 states with these types of programs that encourage landowners to form special areas to support agriculture. The protections and incentives provided to farmers in these districts vary by program and by state. Some states use districts as a way to limit annexation, while others limit the use of eminent domain and offer protection in those districts from the siting of public facilities and infrastructure. Some offer farmers and landowners in those districts tax incentives, and some tie their districts to participation in their state PACE or PDR program. We looked at farm link programs, and here South Carolina is one of only 10 states with a state-supported farm link program. There are many more that are administered by private entities around the country. These programs seek to connect farm seekers with farmers and landowners who want to see their land stay in agriculture. These types of programs can offer a range of services and resources, from online real estate postings to technical assistance, trainings, and educational resources. And then lastly, we looked at state leasing, and these are programs that make state-owned land available to farmers and ranchers for agriculture. Sometimes that's their primary purpose. More often, agricultural use is secondary to generating income for some other public purpose or for protecting wildlife habitat. So now if we go down a little bit, we can see how South Carolina scores relative to other states. It has 4 of the 6 types of policies we scored, and is at or near the median on 3 of them. What I want to point out here is that states with the highest policy responses, so those dark blue scores on the top scores, are states that have faced rapid loss of farmland for decades, and they've had little choice but to respond aggressively. And the point we make here is that as South Carolina feels this development pressure more intently, it will similarly need to increase its policy response if it hopes to retain its agricultural base for a profitable agricultural industry. The website allows you to dive into the factors behind the scores, so we're going to do that for a few of them. You go over here to the select policy or program, and we are going to start with PACE programs. And if you go, let's actually, Beth, if you can scroll to the bottom to see how we scored it. You see, this is the sort of elements that go into every one of these. And then you can see that we weighted because we felt that some elements were more important than others. And that's how we arrive at a final score. So looking at South Carolina, the South Carolina Conservation Bank gets good points for its program infrastructure, and it does better than many states in investing in the program. Where it lags compared to other states is in monitoring, where it gets no score, and in the pace of protection. This is one, the acres protected to acres converted, all the way over on the right-hand side. And again, it's an indication that the rate of protection is not keeping pace with a fairly high rate of conversion. I want to mention here the importance of federal matching funds for working land protection through both the federal agricultural conservation easement program, specifically agricultural land easements, as well as through the regional conservation partnership program. These are both USDA and NRCS programs. We hope that the increased funding for both programs, plus additional statutory flexibility in the 2018 Farm Bill, can increase their use in South Carolina. We are hoping through the National Agricultural Land Network to follow up with conversations this summer and early fall with partners around the Southeast to look at specific challenges and barriers to using these programs more aggressively, because this is a goal of ours and USDA to have these programs used as effectively and efficiently as possible. So let's turn to land use planning. Here, South Carolina gets some points for requiring local governments to prepare conservation plans if a planning commission is formed. You can see that higher scoring states in this category have state goals around retaining their agricultural land and or promoting compact development. They then incentivize or require consistency between these goals and local plans. Some other states provide support or incentives to local governments to develop farmland protection plans and strategies. So let's look quickly at property tax relief. South Carolina here gets points for having some minimum thresholds for participation in the program and for having withdrawal penalties. You can see that there are some states, not many, that use these withdrawal penalty receipts to fund state or county farmland protection programs. And many states track the number of acres enrolled in the program, which South Carolina does not seem to do at the state level, which we feel is an important way of understanding how effectively this property tax program is being used. So lastly, we give South Carolina, as I said, credit for being one of a few states that invest in farm linking, including having staff devoted to the program and to providing technical assistance to farm seekers. Higher scoring states in this category seem to devote more resources to their websites and to additional staff. And they also have explicit statutory authority for the program, which is something that we feel gives the program a little bit more certainty, although we always appreciate that what is given can often be taken away. Just a word about state leasing. We included it in the scorecard because we feel that making state-owned land available for lease provides opportunity for young and new producers. We did not find any evidence in South Carolina of the state offering state-owned land for leasing. If that is incorrect, please let us know, but that is our understanding, that this is not something that happens in South Carolina. We think it's important to provide this type of opportunity, particularly in a state like South Carolina, where there is 5 times as many producers over 65 as under age 35. So creating new opportunities for younger farmers is important. And with that, I think I'm going to stop there, Billy. I guess we should go out of the website now. If you have questions, please do write them in. And as we go out of the website, we're going to launch a poll which asks which policy or policies you think would be most valuable to focus on for South Carolina. And my apologies, we did not have the room to put in the other 2. We probably should have not said not sure, need more info. But if you feel that state-owned land, leasing, or farm link are the most important, please feel free to write them in on the question panel. Okay. Great. This is very helpful to see these answers here. And obviously, land use planning is a very important suite of tools to focus on. And Billy's going to talk a little bit more about those as well. But clearly, an interest in expanding the use of purchase of easements and how the state could do more and could be more successful in accessing some of those federal funds. So, and I should say, I forgot to say that the National Agricultural Land Network will be hosting a series of policy webinars beginning in the early fall, which we hope will be a way for those of you who want to learn more about some of these specific tools and techniques to learn from those states that are at the top of the board in terms of their scores and what has made those successful programs and what might be relevant to other states. So with that, I just want to say that one aspect of spatial data that we were not able to build in is protected agricultural land. This is because there is not to date a comprehensive data layer focused specifically on protected agricultural land. We are building this new database now. If you have not heard from us and you hold agricultural conservation easements, please let us know that by adding a comment in the question panel, and we will be back in touch because we want to make sure that we get everybody's data. I do see some green there in South Carolina, so we clearly have gotten some information, but we want to make sure that we have everyone. So let's stop now with that and see, Billy, if there are any questions.
Thank you, Chris. As I don't see any questions, actually, I do. We just had a question come on. The question is, does your data break out density levels of low density residential, meaning suburban style development lots, such as a 1/3 acre to 1 acre lots to 10-acre lots and so on? Do you want me to take that, Chris, or do you want to?
Well, let me start and you fill it in. So it would help to probably, to describe a little bit about how we used the methodology. But that the methodology is that we use the combination of the Census of Agriculture and the farm size by county. And we took basically the lowest 10% of farms as the cutoff in terms of that parcel size. In the lowest 10% is what we used as the sort of cutoff. And then we looked at the housing census and census blocks associated with that. The full methodology can be found in one of those, in that tab that we showed you at the very beginning. But within that, we did not segregate that further out between 1 acre and whatever that sort of threshold was in that particular county. So I think the answer, and I guess my only hesitation on it, is that I'm not sure at what point we considered something converted to urban and highly developed. And I'm wondering, Billy, whether you know exactly how we did that. So where that transition is between those very small parcels and whether those are considered urban or those are considered low density.
Thanks, Chris. In order to address the question, I think that what we're talking about here, whether it be 1/3 of an acre or an acre or 10 acres or 15 acres or 20 acres, anything in that range is going to be a non-agricultural unit along the spectrum from rural to urban high density development. So, and just to be more specific, these are lots that are non-agricultural. These are the McMansions. Most of the folks on the call know what we're talking about here. But the point is that with enough of these non-agricultural lots proliferating in the rural area, it becomes more and more urbanized over time. So urban high density development, I would consider land that has been zoned for non-agricultural uses. The low density residential development would be land in your rural areas that is being fragmented for suburban uses, regardless of the size of the lot, from 1/3 of an acre to 10, 15, 20 acres. These are suburban growth patterns that we're talking about here. So that's how we'll answer that question. And if there are additional questions at the end, we will respond to those after the conclusion of the webinar. So I think that right now what we want to talk about here, and this is the perfect segue, is that time is not on our side in saving our farmland and our ranch land, which is why American Farmland Trust just announced a bold goal of doubling the amount of permanently protected farmland by 2040 and reducing the rate of farmland conversion from 2,000 acres a day to 500 acres a day by 2040. We know that to get to this goal, we will need to lock arms with the many partners and practitioners on this call and others around the United States who are deeply concerned about saving the land that sustains us. Now I'd like to discuss some of the ways that American Farmland Trust will be strengthening its commitment to farmland protection across the country and in the Southeast specifically. And we're going to be showing you these on our next slide. And I think that just starting this conversation, we'll say that Chris has touched on establishing the National Agricultural Network, providing new leadership in key locations. So American Farmland Trust is going to be expanding our physical presence in the Southeast with 2 locations within the next year. Protecting more farmland ourselves with partners. American Farmland Trust is a land trust. And we hold conservation easements, but we don't hold conservation easements in areas where there's a viable ag land trust in place or a viable PACE or PDR program in place. We hold conservation easements where there's not a viable entity in place. We created many of the land trust and PACE and PDR programs across the country, and we would not want to create redundancy in our conservation efforts. But we will be partnering with our land trust and PACE and PDR partners to advocate for additional funding and, if necessary, to actually team up and hold conservation easements together. Advocating for stronger state and federal policies, we want the folks on this call to use this data to advocate for stronger state and federal policies. I will offer myself and my time to the groups that are represented on this call to go with you to meet with state legislators to discuss changing state policies around farmland protection and the future of agriculture. American Farmland Trust has an entire federal policy team that works out of our Washington, D.C. office, and they are working on these issues every day. Promoting research-based decision-making, I think that's what we're talking about with this data, that basing future decisions on future land use on research. And now with our next slide, this gives us an opportunity to go into this a little bit more specifically about what more can South Carolina do. And that's analyzing using this data. And if you haven't had a chance to go to our microsite and access the data yourself, we are sharing all of this data to anyone on this call to analyze and map agricultural land trends and conditions and 2, to strengthen or adopt a coordinated suite of policies. So I'm going to spend just a little bit of time on this point. It's critically important that counties and municipalities have planning commissions and professional planning staffs to plan for the future. Whatever to plan for the future of agriculture, to plan for future urban uses and non-agricultural uses, so that the overall planning process and the vision for each community goes hand in glove. And that includes having a comprehensive planning process in every county and every municipality. And within that comprehensive plan, having a goal for farmland protection in each county. It's challenging to work towards conserving farmland unless there's an actual goal that is embedded in an ordinance and or in a comprehensive plan for farmland protection in each county. Urban growth boundaries have been used successfully across the nation, where you have non-agricultural uses inside boundaries and agricultural uses outside of those boundaries, and those boundaries are typically reevaluated every time there's a comprehensive plan update on whether or not the boundary needs to be expanded. So you're focusing on compact contiguous development. It's not a no growth strategy, it's a smart growth strategy. And I know that there are several groups on this call that know exactly what we're talking about there. Large lot minimums in your rural area. This is critically important, that in your rural areas, that your minimum lot size is a viable agricultural unit. So we move away from the low density residential. And each community will need to decide on their own what they consider a viable agricultural unit to be. Is it 30 acres? Is it 40 acres? I'm from Lexington, Kentucky. The minimum lot size in Lexington is 40 acres in the rural area for one house. You cannot subdivide your farm if you have less than 80 acres, because you have to have 40 to split off and 40 left. And that has really changed the trajectory of Lexington in terms of our agricultural industries, because we previously had a 10-acre minimum, and we saw a proliferation of 10-acre lotting, which was really a gross misuse of our rural land and a proliferation of septic tank development. Agricultural zoning is critically important to prohibit non-agricultural uses in your ag areas, and farmland protection. So clearly you have a very successful state farmland conservation program, but having local programs are equally important where appropriate. And American Farmland Trust helped to secure $2 billion for farmland protection in the Farm Bill, and that requires a match, a local or state match, or a landowner can donate 50% of the appraised fair market value of the conservation easement and receive the other 50% in cash. And finally, we'll talk about cost of community services studies. American Farmland Trust has done over 80 of these studies over the last several years, and they all say the same thing. Sprawl, low density residential development uses more in services than it pays in taxes. Consistently, ag, on the other hand, uses less in services than it pays in taxes, and your core urban areas are using even less in services than they pay in taxes. So what that means is the more you grow in a compact, contiguous manner, the less burden there is on the taxpayer. And although ag and your core urban areas are creating a net gain on the tax dollar, sprawl is exceeding that amount, and it is going beyond those gains. So it is exceeding the tax dollars with the services provided, because it's a one-time economic impact, but you have to provide those ongoing services. the infrastructure that's required for those areas. So you can access those cost of community services at farmlandinfo.org, and just type in cost of community services in the search field, and you can see those for yourself. I'll move on here and emphasize supporting farm viability and access to land, planning for agriculture, not just around it. So when you have agriculture that's surrounded by non-agricultural uses, it's very likely that it will convert to low density residential or urban uses in the future, because agriculture and conservation are difficult to achieve in those circumstances. Saving the best, but don't forget the rest. And I know the solar siting conversation is one that South Carolina is having, and American Farmland Trust has a solar siting guideline document. If you go to farmland.org, which is our main website, which is different than farmlandinfo.org, go to farmland.org and type in solar siting in the search field, and you will see the documents about the best way to site solar panels. So save the best, but don't forget the rest. And at that point, I think, Chris, if you want to take it from here.
Great, thanks, Billy. If folks have any other questions, please feel free to write them in now. We don't have any right now. And I just wanted to mention then the next iteration of our policy scorecard, and some of the policies that we didn't include here that do relate to the land. We just, again, as I mentioned before, this is our first attempt at a scorecard. We didn't want to bite off more than we could chew on the first one. So the second one is going to focus a little bit more on conservation practices on the land and what states are doing to support those. But we are also looking at conservation tax credits that some states have, and things around beginning farmer tax credits and other programs that are focused really, again, on that opportunity for young and new generation farmers to gain access to land. And the last one is looking at those states that are doing something around what we call agricultural land mitigation, but essentially it's thinking about where they are siting infrastructure and having limits on where some of that state-funded infrastructure goes, so that, again, it gets back to the planning, trying to be thoughtful in how a state is incentivizing or disincentivizing investments, state investments in and on and around some of the agricultural land in the state. So with that, I was going to go to the next, I was going to wrap up here in talking about the network, but we do have a couple of questions. And I think, Billy, this one is probably for you. This is, according to the 2717 Census of Ag, 22% of farms in Greenville County are 1 to 9 acres, 48% are between 10 and 49 acres. What would you suggest as a minimum lot size for rural ag areas in such a county, keeping in mind that most rural ag areas of Greenville County, 2/3 of the county, are currently unzoned?
Thank you, Chris. I'll just say that this is a conversation that that county needs to have as part of a comprehensive planning process. It is not a one-size-fits-all approach. I'll use the Lexington, Kentucky example here for this conversation. Lexington had the first urban growth boundary in the United States in 1958 with no lot minimum in the rural area from 1958 to 1964. And then we had a 10-acre minimum from 1964 to 1998. So what we found is between 1990 and 1997, we lost 4,700 acres to 10-acre lot development. And if we took that acreage, 4,700 acres, and put it inside the belt line that runs around Lexington, we could have gotten 20,000 typical residential lots. But instead, we only got 429. And that was the call to action when we knew that it was not a proactive approach for the future of agriculture in our community. And the community entered into a 3-year conversation and developed a rural area land management plan. And that land management plan, which you can access online, Fayette County Rural Land Management Plan, made 2 recommendations when it was adopted in 1999. One was to increase the minimum lot size in our county from 10 acres to 40 acres, and 2 was to implement a purchase of development rights program to compensate the landowner for the loss of that 10-acre right. And what we were finding is that, again, this is not a no-growth strategy, but a lot of the 10-acre lotting around Lexington adjoined the urban growth boundary, and the folks that were living out there didn't want any expansion. So they were choking off the urban growth boundary, and that would have created a situation where we would have ended up with leapfrog development if we had not increased the lot minimum. And so that it's really a conversation for this community to have with itself in determining what is a viable agricultural unit and what are the patterns on these smaller lots. And I think the key word here is are currently unzoned. So I think the key is, do you want agricultural zoning? You want to define what's in those areas very specifically, and you want to define a goal for farmland protection, and you also want to define your minimum lot size in your rural area.
Great, thank you, Billy. There's one other question, which is, are there efforts to intersect yields of different crops with farmland under threat? And if I understand the question, well, I think I'll interpret it to mean this way. As we were calculating the PVR indexes, we did not look at crop yield per se in calculating those indexes. We used a combination of cropland data layers of the national land cover and use, the land capability classes, the Sturgio, and trying to, again, you can tell I'm not the researcher here and not the expert here, but we did not look at yields. We looked at the things that lead to yields, so capability classes and soils being one indication. The other thing that I would say in terms of our PVR values, we very intently looked at the types of crops that had been produced over a period of time. And this was in part to recognize the specialty crops, particularly, that don't always show up and are not always recognized because they're sometimes on unique soils or in unique microclimates. So the way that we did those calculations and the weighting of some of the factors that went into it gave greater weight to some of those factors that would lead to specialty crop land that has been growing a variety of specialty crops would be factored in there. So I hope that that's helpful. If you want more information, please do. You can read through the PVR methodology that again can be found in that reports and data tab on the website. And with that, unless Billy, you have anything to add, I think what I would like to do is to just go here for a minute to talk about both the Farmland Information Center and the National Ag Land Network. So, and as we're doing this, maybe Beth, you could launch the last poll. As you can see, we're asking a poll about what kind of technical assistance you would find most valuable and useful in your work around agricultural land. And we ask that because the Farmland Information Center, which has been a collaboration with NRCS for decades, is focused on providing information and technical support to folks who are engaged in agriculture, thinking about agricultural land. And that is from landowners themselves. So for instance, on the Farmland Information Center, a landowner or a producer could find information about what is an agricultural conservation easement, what makes it different from just a basic conservation easement. Where could I go to find a public program or a land trust that could help me protect my land? Those are the types of resources that are available through the FIC. We are building up our resources around the agricultural conservation easement program particularly. So we hope that will be helpful. The second thing that the FIC, as we like to call it, provides is a wealth of resources for those practitioners and professionals, many of whom are on the call today, who are having to make the case for either permanent protection or for simply retaining agricultural land. There's a wealth of information about, as Billy mentioned, cost of community services. There are many studies about the economic benefits and impacts of agricultural land, whether that's permanent protection or just agricultural land in general. There's wealth of statistics from the Census of Agriculture, from the NRI, and there is an answering service. So I hope that everybody will make use of the Farmland Information Center because they are there to answer your questions of any kind, policy questions as well. So let's stop this poll. Appreciate people's thinking about what they would like to see more information around. This is very helpful. And let me then finish with the network. The National Agricultural Land Network is a new initiative launched by AFT that I will be heading up. These webinars have been the first of our programming, but our intent is really to build the collective capacity of all of us to do more, and that's more protection, that is keeping more land in agriculture, that is trying to figure out how do we make those connections between the work that we do around farm and ranch land protection, plus encouraging access to land, helping to support that transfer of land and keeping it in agriculture. It's having conversations amongst peers around what are the best easement deed terms and conditions. How do we do better outreach to producers? We hope that folks will join up to be members of it. It is free. We will be doing additional programming. Our next set of programming will be these policy webinars that we talked about, but we will have many more programming, and hopefully at the point in time when we can do it again, to be back in person and have some regional forums that might focus specifically on ASEP or on RCPP, or just on how do we do a better work, how do we learn from each other in both planning tools and in protection tools. So with that, let me stop, Billy, and hand it back to you to wrap up.
Thanks, Chris. I want to thank everyone who's joined us today, and just really go back and focus on the fact that planning for the future of agriculture, you are planning for the future to retain all of the economic impacts of agriculture in South Carolina. $3 billion in cash farm receipts in 2017, $750 million in agricultural exports. Your farmland is truly the factory floor of your agricultural, agribusiness, and agritourism industries. I am available at bvanpelt@farmland.org to answer additional questions. And I am also available on LinkedIn if you would like to reach out to me. I would welcome the connection. I'm in South Carolina frequently and am planning to be there again throughout the remainder of this year and in the future. So I would also welcome a meeting with any of the groups that called in today. So thank you for joining us.